I'm Michael Krasny. I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews. You can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of timely and intellectually engaging topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode, we present the second of 4 episodes I'm honored to be bringing to you, sponsored by Stanford University's Bill Lane Center for the American West, and focusing on a range of topics related to the North American West, a place whose natural beauty is matched only by the challenges it faces. Our hope is that this series will draw attention to the region, particularly in this era of climate change. And the Lane Center, I should say, was founded in 2005 by our first Lane guest, Professor and Pulitzer Prize winner David M. Kennedy and Richard White. And our guest this episode is Stanford-based journalist Felicity Barringer. Let me say some things about her. She is also an editor and lead writer for the Lane Center's online magazine and the West. And she's with Jeff McGee, the founder of that magazine. She's also a former national environmental correspondent, reporter, and editor for the New York Times for nearly 3 decades, and wrote for 9 years for the Washington Post and was a Moscow correspondent for the New York Times. I'm pleased to welcome her for the second of 4 Lane Center-sponsored Gray Matter with Michael Krasny podcast. Let me say that the heart of And the West coverage has always been environmental reporting, from droughts to floods to land use and wildfire issues. The magazine also focuses on important regional issues like the western states and counties' checkerboard of laws involving marijuana use, population movements, hunting, ranching, and native issues. So there's much to us to cover here. We thank the Bill Lane Center and its current director, Professor Bruce Kane, for sponsoring this series, and invite you to visit the center's website at west.stanford.edu to learn more about its research programs and journalism. And you can also follow the Bill Lane Center on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And welcome, Felicity. Good to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Michael. I have listened to you for many years, and it's wonderful to have a chance to talk.
I am delighted as well, and I hope we can also talk about your journalistic work in Russia, but I really want to focus, of course, on environmental issues, and so much that we can and really ought to focus on. I was just thinking, in fact, about how water has become so important once again, because just recently, I like to bring current news stories in as much as I can. Governor Newsom, who Donald Trump, Republican candidate for president, called Newscum, are in a kind of verbal fight, as former President Trump is with so many. And he said, in effect, he would not give us what we need if there were wildfires, if this fight over smelt and Newsom's desire to do what he wants to do moves forward. So let's just talk about that. I mean, about half our body is water. Over about 70% of the planet is water. When we think of California, we think of Chinatown and water almost immediately.
Yeah.
How equipped are we? How able are we, putting Trump aside for the moment, to deal with what we have to deal with?
We still have an awful lot of obstacles, Michael. I think the biggest problem is the biggest user of water is agriculture. But the fact that California's agriculture feeds so much of the country as well as so much of the state itself means that it's very hard to say you can't have all the water you want. The state has said that, particularly when it comes to groundwater, there are obvious restrictions on surface water too, depending on how much of a drought there is at any given time. But the existing controls are not enough to ensure water for the future. So how much of a problem is it for California? It is significant, and maybe we'll end up having less agriculture and having to pay more for food in order to preserve our water.
That's sounding very serious and sobering. When we had a conversation with David Kennedy, we were talking about the Colorado River, and that plays, of course, a central role in the West, doesn't it, in terms of the future? How do you see that?
Well, the Colorado, of course, the way the Colorado River was divided, as you know, there had been, at the early part of the 20th century, there'd been year after year of excessive rains and great flow in the Colorado River. Based on that very mistaken set of averages from those wet years, the Colorado River was divided among the 7 basin states based on the idea that there would be 15 million acre feet coming out every year. Well, guess what? There hasn't been for years. And as you know, there have been very difficult negotiations between the states, particularly the three lower basin states, California, Arizona, and Nevada, about who's going to cut back and how much they're going to cut back. And it's after we all know about the history of Los Angeles and Chinatown and stealing the water from the Owens Valley, but now they're looking at Los Angeles is looking very seriously at water recycling, which 20 years ago was anathema. They used to be called toilet to tap.
Well, there's also a lot of new technology, though, that's at least giving some hope here, isn't there? I'm talking particularly about desalination. I know a lot of that's in San Diego, but it's still moving forward. There's been a lot of progress, I know.
There has been. The issue with desalination, everything comes at a cost, and desalination uses a huge amount of energy.
It's very expensive, yeah.
So if you're going to use desalination, and when you think about the energy future of the West, there will be more desalination plants. They'll be fought over, but they have to come if people are going to be able to have the water they need. But there's also going to be a huge demand for electricity as data centers get built out. And the amount of electricity the West is going to need, even if you just consider those two things, leave aside population gain or any other parameters, the amount of electricity the West is going to need is going to accelerate pretty fast over the next 20 years. And desalination is going to be part of that, but it's not going to solve every water problem. In the end, reuse and conservation have to be a major part of the answer.
Well, also, lithium is a part of the answer with electricity, but so, of course, is the possibility of moving more toward geothermal. You've written about both of those. Let's kind of put those into a package and talk about where we can head here and what we can progress towards. I mean, I'm thinking drill, baby, drill, which is the words we're hearing from President Trump, former President Trump. And there's a lot of possibilities, really, with geothermal that are opening up for us. As far as electricity is concerned, lithium, a lot of it's concentrated here in the West, isn't it?
Lithium is very much concentrated here in the West, and access to geothermal is, the West is the sort of center of hot rocks under the ground. Not all of them are very close to the surface. In Sonoma County, they're very close to the surface, and the geysers has been producing electricity for the better part of 80 years. But now there's new technology, as you noticed a second ago. The new technology takes what's been learned in natural gas extraction and the fracking that's been done over the last couple of decades, and it takes that technology and transfers it to figuring out ways to create cracks in rocks that will allow water to get down to where the hot rocks are and let it come back up. And that is fundamentally changing the geothermal industry, which has always been there, but sort of an also-ran. Nobody paid much attention to it.
No, it's growing. I mean, it shouldn't necessarily inspire too much hope, but it does. It's a good alternative use of energy, isn't it?
It is. And they've 2 or 3 new companies. I'm thinking of Fervo, that was started by, I think, a Stanford law student and a Stanford business student maybe 4 years ago, and a company called Sage. And they are building out very fast. And one of them is building a geothermal center connected to a data center. And that's going to be the future, I think, for a lot of these high-demand electrical outfits like data centers.
And so many other things that we can think about that are going to demand more electricity, including cars. We hope there will be more of those, but then we run into some other environmental problems. I want to get back to water, though, for a moment, because you mentioned groundwater, and I want to sort of take the pulse, if I can, with you about how groundwater looks and how it appears to you, especially under the Central Valley, because we got new controls there, don't we?
Oh, yeah. So it's been 10 years since the state of California passed a law called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And nobody wants that word to have to say that word salad fast. So it's called SGMA by everybody by its friends and its enemies. It's called SGMA. And SGMA set out an entire structure. Okay, local water basins. We're going to identify you, and then you're going to create your own little government called groundwater management agencies. And you're going to produce a plan for how you're going to have your basin sustainable by 2040. Sounds simple, right? The agencies were created. The plans were sent to the state. The hook in the law was, the whole purpose of the law was it should be local, it should be local, it should be local. But the state reserves the right to say, your plan is not going to do what it's supposed to do, and it's going to cause a bunch of bad things to happen, and so we're not going to accept your plan. 10 years into this system, Michael, the rubber is meeting the road, and various two groundwater management agencies have been put on probation because they haven't been able to get a plan that the state says will do the job. And there are now lawsuits happening. This is where the rubber meets the road. They're saying, you don't have the right to tell us to do that. You don't have the right to put us on probation. And one judge in the Central Valley, I think in Kings County, has agreed with the farmers and said, no, they don't have the right to put you on probation. And there are complicated reasons for that I don't want to bore your listeners by getting into. But the state is going to have to figure out how to win these lawsuits in order to be able to control groundwater.
Well, we've got all kinds of legal puzzles that are coming up and they're facing us, and how to get out of them and how to resolve them. Maybe we can talk about this in a little more detail. But I'm also, since we're talking about water, interested in getting your thoughts about sea level rise, which is really a serious problem, especially for the coastal communities, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is. And some are doing what they can to deal with it. Generally, the people who are expert on sea level rise say almost nobody is doing enough. But we had a story by a young woman who worked with me when she was a Stanford student about 6 years ago about Foster City. Okay, Foster City is just a little bit south of the airport. And it was built, only about 50 years ago.
Built on landfill, I believe.
Exactly. It was built on landfill. This isn't a great thing going forward if the levels of the bay, water levels of the bay rise. So their insurance, when you get down to dealing with climate change, the only thing that really seems to work, government has troubles. The insurance industry is what works, which means they're going to be the bad guy for a long time. In Foster City, the insurance industry said, you have a problem. So they built themselves, they already had a levee, they built it about 10 feet higher. And they say that'll be enough. And the people who live in Foster City love it. And they survived the earthquake of...
Loma Prieta, you mean?
Loma Prieta, 89, was it?
I think it was 89, yeah.
And so Foster City survived 89 very well, the 89 earthquake very well. And it's the people who run it say, look, we managed with an earthquake, we can manage with sea level rise. It's not clear that they can. And more work is going on in the Bay. I was just with a Stanford course this past September, walking along areas in Burlingame on the shore where they are going to have to create more space and more wetlands in order to save the buildings that are built right up against the water.
And you mentioned insurance. I mean, insurance companies are moving away from the West because of the fires, aren't they? I mean, they're making premiums in areas that are vulnerable, not accessible.
Yeah, exactly. And they are doing that because as an industry, they got to survive. Yeah, you may not get as much as you want if your house burns down or floods, but you won't get anything if the insurance company goes out of business. So that is the bottom line for the insurance companies is if you want property insurance, you got to listen to our strictures. And you've had plenty of states, most not in the West, some more in the flooding areas of the East, that have said, oh no, you can't plan your insurance premiums based on what you think is going to happen. You have to plan them on what happened in the past, i.e. you can't think about climate change.
Well, let's talk about climate change. I want to talk about in depth with you because you've done some really fine journalistic work in depth, particularly about AB 32, the climate change bill, and covered the California carbon reduction. Where are we now? I mean, in California, most of the politicians seem to tell us, they're all Democrats, of course, they're telling us we're way ahead in conservation, we're way ahead in climate change. And it's true, we are in the West in general ahead of other regions of the country, but it's a long way to go still.
I was going to say that's one way to look at it. But I'm just trying to think of the analogy. Can you imagine being told you're way ahead of the tortoises? You're fast.
Well, it's a good metaphor, yeah. But we are way ahead of the tortoises, I mean, in the West. And yet at the same time, I hope we're tortoises that can win the race against whatever the hares are here.
That would be great. I think, and the debates on this are fierce. And if I say anything in favor of one thing or another, I'm sure my email box will fill up. But I do think next generation nuclear, the really small scale nuclear that Microsoft is working on, and they're trying to set up those very small scale nuclear stations near their new data centers. I don't think, however much I live through 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and think nuclear has major issues, I don't think we can deal with climate change without more than solar and wind. We're going to have other sources of energy that don't create carbon.
You had to maybe talk about this, a front seat, as you describe it, at Chernobyl. But as concerned and as anxious as we are about nuclear and moving more toward nuclear, I'm in utter agreement with you. It's absolutely necessary. I mean, look what the French have done and look at what Israel's done. I mean, it speaks volumes to us about the necessity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Israel's been ahead of the game on nuclear. It's been ahead of the game on desalination because it had to. The energy and water are the two of the 3 pillars that the future depends on. The other pillar is governments that work. And, we're having issues with all 3 of them now. But I think the energy issue and the water issue are completely intertwined, and they have to be dealt with as a whole rather than, okay, we'll do energy over here and we'll do water over here, and that'll be, and we won't make them relate to one another.
There's a fear, though, about nuclear waste and about how to dispose and all that that's still very strong in many environmentalist minds. And I think it's almost innate in some of them. I don't know how you move the checkerboard as far as that's concerned.
I wish I had an answer for that, Michael. I mean, obviously, Yucca Mountain has not worked, and the latest, not that I think it's moving forward, but the indigenous populations near there, I think it's a branch of the Shoshone tribes, are saying, hey, wait a minute, this is our sacred land, our land, you can't put nuclear waste there. There will never be a community that accepts nuclear waste.
Well, why not send it into outer space? That's what friends of mine at NASA were saying for years.
I think that if Elon Musk could do that, God bless Elon Musk.
That may cause a lot of emails to come in, too, when you say God bless Elon Musk. Actually, I saw somebody put a label on their Tesla that said, now that I know who he really is, I'm sorry I bought this car. It's actually on the car. But we don't want to get into partisan politics.
To cut down on the emails, I'll say I'm very sympathetic to that bumper sticker.
Well, you're talking about the necessity, really, of nuclear waste. Any idea how politically that could move forward in the West? I mean, use of nuclear energy, yeah.
The use of nuclear energy, politically, I think that can move forward. Look at what just happened in California. And Gavin Newsom saying, we're going to close this nuclear plant, and then turning around less than a year later and saying, oops, never mind. So does that mean there are going to be new nuclear plants? Again, not of the old type, not of the 3 Mile Island type, but can there be new smaller scale nuclear plants? I hope so. And I hope that a governor like Gavin Newsom, who does seem to be enlightened on some of these issues and willing to take the heat for doing things that environmentalists consider heresy, I'm hoping that politicians like him can do this.
And what can our politicians do, in your judgment? Weighing in with you on things that you have considered seriously, and I know you're a journalist and you don't not necessarily want to come down on partisan views and everything, but the salmon runs. I keep thinking about the salmon runs, and I mean, the dams were a big problem, obviously, but there are other problems that we seem to be facing and continue to face, and this is pretty serious stuff too.
It is, and as you go further south, think of where the salmon streams are. You're starting up in Alaska and going right down through British Columbia, Washington, Oregon. Basically, I think the San Joaquin River was always the southernmost river that allowed for salmon to come up and spawn and salmon runs to happen. There are fewer and fewer salmon runs there. One of the reasons, I believe, and if my scientist friends will correct me on this if I'm wrong, is that it's getting warmer. It's not just that...
It's climate change again.
Yeah, exactly. It's climate change. And so one of the questions I've had put to me by a scientist was, if you want to spend a certain amount of money to preserve salmon, why not spend it where it's going to do the most good and where the salmon are most likely to be preserved? Doing that, of course, means that you're throwing other salmon runs out. And no environmentalist is going to say, oh, it's okay to lose the San Joaquin salmon runs, or it's okay to lose, not that we're planning on that, the Sacramento salmon runs. Nobody can say that out loud, but you've only got so much money in the world, and you've only got this portion of it to spend on ensuring a future for salmon. Where do you spend it? And do you spend it where it's going to do the most good, or do you spread it out all over the place? I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I was just thinking about some of the other obstacles in addition to climate change that are affecting that. You've got pesticides still, right, having impact.
Yes.
You've got predators. You've got changes in habitat. I mean, all these things figure in, don't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But most of the changes in the salmon's environment have been dams. Yes, pesticides. Yes, changes in habitat. But dams are the biggest thing that have made the greatest changes and done the most damage to salmon runs on the Pacific coast.
And yet there are those who say, in some ways we may need to look to dams in the future again, don't we?
Sort of like nukes, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a good analogy. How about something else you've written about and have engaged my interest with? Seaweed farming. I mean, this is kind of a fledgling industry, but there are a lot of people who are very hopeful about it in terms of feeding people who need to be fed, but also providing good, healthy food and all that sort of thing.
First, I need to correct you. I would love to take credit for the story you read on seaweed farming.
Oh, it was Miss Choi who wrote that story.
That's right. It was Sophia Siegel, and she did a fantastic job. She came to me with that idea. And okay, let's say you're an editor for my publication, Mike, and somebody says to you, I want to do an article on seaweed farming. Do you go, oh yeah, that would be great? Or do you go, huh? And she convinced me, completely convinced me. I said, figure out how the economics are going to work, particularly since the Asian seaweed farms are, light years ahead of us, and the Asian population eats seaweed, which not many of us do. And she found a terrific analogy, which is if you'd had this conversation about soybeans 100 years ago, it would have seemed as strange to think that soybeans were going to be a big crop. And guess what happened? So the notion is, if seaweed could turn a few minds around, either about eating it or feeding it to cows, when it'll ideally reduce the amount of methane they produce in their digestive system, the possibility for seaweed is immense, but it's going to take a while before the right things happen and the possibility is realized.
Yeah, I was convinced. The biofuels, for example, weigh into this whole equation. And why are they so ahead in Korea, for example? Because aside from the fact that they eat seaweed.
Actually, I don't really know the answer to that, Mike. I think it's because it is a normal thing in their lives. They use it for themselves. They use it. Then they've started using it for lots of other things. And I think once you accept a product, particularly an agricultural product, as central to some part of your life, you can have enough of it to try out all kinds of other uses. Any of these uses require growing a hell of a lot of seaweed, much more than we do.
But you think there are real economic possibilities with seaweed in terms of the West?
Maybe not in our lifetimes. I think maybe 50 years hence.
Yeah, if we're still here, let's hope that's the case. I'm also going to ask you about something. I don't want to get too pessimistic here about too many things. We're touching on a lot of disaster stuff, but dust storms also is something that you've written about and have convinced me, along with some other stuff that I've read, that this is pretty serious stuff, not only for drivers, but for maybe the whole species and for public health. I mean, it has all kinds of ramifications. And we're talking again about climate change, and we're talking about water diversions and the effects of those kinds of things, aren't we?
Well, exactly. And the thing that fascinated me about dust was, on the one hand, if you're covering the West and environment in the West and you say the West is dusty, a whole lot of people, maybe even you, would say, yeah, well, it's always been dusty. The fact is,
The Dust Bowl.
exactly, the Dust Bowl. The fact is that the dust is getting worse and can do more damage. Why? In the Dust Bowl, there weren't cars driving down highways at 85 miles an hour. There were cars, but they didn't drive that fast, and they weren't going to drive into dust storms. During the Dust Bowl, there wasn't the same amount of population concentration of people who were breathing in the dust. The dust, if you look at most of the articles in the West, you'll see there's a real rural tilt to what we're doing. Environmental stories, not entirely, but they often tend to be rural. And dust is a completely rural issue. And some of the increased dust, you talk about climate change, comes out of the inland saline lakes, of which there are, dozens within the West. The biggest is the Great Salt Lake. As they dry up, their shores blow away. And their shores can be full of pesticides, yes, of human-caused pollution, but also of natural pollution like arsenic.
And I read something that since you mentioned the rural connection to dust and the dangers of dust, I read something you were writing actually about cannabis, and you said the West or California can be divided into rural, urban, and native. I want to maybe look at that for a moment with you. But that's not only true about cannabis, that's true really about the West, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. And Michael, this magazine is about the evolution of the West in the 21st century, but the magazine itself has had an evolution. And while the very first story we did was about native fishing rights and how they are, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, they protect environmental values. And so environmental groups lean on the native fishing rights. The fact is that as the magazine evolved, I realized maybe 3-4 years ago that if you're going to write about environment in the West and not focus a fair amount of coverage on native issues, you're doing no justice to the reality and to the history. And I want to try to reflect both the reality of the future of the West and the history of the West. And so I've tried to make a much more concerted effort to add things like the Q&A we did with Elizabeth Reese, who was Stanford's first native law professor, and to do more things about indigenous questions, like, of all the land in the United States that could use solar energy, where you could get solar energy, native land has some of the best, what they call insularity, the best sun. And so can you put solar panels and build out industrial solar on native lands? It's not that easy, particularly when you have a large reservation like the Navajo reservation, and you have more than 100,000 people there, nearly 200,000 people, and they're divided into chapters, maybe 110 chapters or more, and each chapter has the right to say what's done with its land. And I found out in researching that story about can you do solar on native reservations, that the Navajo chapters had gone through a really incredibly cruel set of actions by the federal government, not back in the days of the Indian Wars, but under the Roosevelt administration. Because getting back to dust, after the abuses of the late 19th century, the government sort of said, we're sorry, and here's some sheep, and you can do good things with these sheep. 40 years later, the Hoover Dam had just been built, the Dust Bowl was happening, and the Navajo had done incredibly well with their sheep. The sheep were eating a lot of grass. The government was afraid the dust would blow into Hoover Dam and wreck things. Into the reservoir and wreck things. So they went and they insisted that the sheep be given up to them, or they killed the sheep in front of their owners. So again, this is just about out of living memory. This was in the 30s and maybe early 40s. But if you have that government now coming and saying, and you should build solar and it's really good and you should trust us, they remember all the reasons not to trust the government.
Yeah, and they have many reasons going back even farther, obviously not to trust the government. Elizabeth Reese, I hope, by the way, we're going to do one of these Lane Center podcasts with as well.
That would be great. She's wonderful.
Looking forward to that possibility. But let me pursue this a little bit with you, because when we talked to David Kennedy, the first of these Lane podcasts, we were talking to him specifically about Native Americans, and he was pointing out how, well, casinos have changed sort of a lot of things in terms of just their resources and what they're able to do. And he was talking about a very central role they're playing now in environmental laws, despite the kind of problems they've had with the federal government. They're playing a much more direct role, a much more immediate role in terms of changing environmental laws and preserving. I mean, those fishing rights go back, what, about 170 years or so?
The fishing rights go back to the 1850s.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's 170 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the natives they have a little more power now than they used to, and they have certainly more impact, and they have their own sovereignty and all that, but they certainly are very involved in policy, environmental policy, much more than ever would have been expected.
That's right. And I think it's interesting to see what mechanism they're using to enforce their rights. They tend to go to the courts. They don't get much done. Certainly, they don't get much done in state legislatures. Because when it comes to Native affairs, historically, going way back, and David Kennedy is going to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but historically, the states were not friends of indigenous rights because it competed with their voters, their farmers, their fishermen, whoever else. Why should we give the Native people these rights when we should give them to our own folks? The federal government has been the agency that has been, although it was horrible to begin with, decided that it needed to protect Native rights. So they have often, Native groups have often gone to the courts to enforce the environmental strictures that need to happen.
And they've had some successes, really, haven't they?
Absolutely. The Washington State case that we wrote about is, it continued after we wrote about it, but they were saying, we're supposed to have salmon. We were guaranteed that by a treaty. You've not just dammed the rivers, put in all these culverts by the side of the highways, which block the streams that the salmon would go up. You need to take out these culverts. And the state of Washington said, are you kidding? Do you know how much money it would be to take out those culverts? And the lawyers for the tribe said, yes, and you got to do it. And the federal courts upheld them. And that, and it went right up to the top, and those culverts are being removed.
Well, there's still a concern of Native people, not only about looking back at the history that they've been through and what they've endured, much of it because of the federal government, but also and the distrust that you alluded to before. But there's also, I think, a strong sense of what's generally is called environmental racism, where they've been exploited and they've been essentially terribly abused, really.
Well, one of the things, Michael, that is important in thinking about Native tribes in the land, and I should interrupt myself here and say that for me to speak to you about what Native people want or what they can do or whatever there's a lot of hubris in that. They should really be speaking for themselves. And so I apologize for saying anything that may go beyond what they'd want to say. But they have the ability to, as I said, to go to court, to fight things. They also have the ability, and tribes have been doing this, to get back land. How do you control the environment? You control the land. You have your sovereign land. As you know, and I'm sure David Kennedy told you, in the late 19th century, something called the Dawes Act made sure the idea was, we don't want these people on reservations where everything's collective. We want them to have individual land ownership. And so they were forced to disaggregate large portions of the reservation land. Millions of acres were lost because an indigenous individual who was in money trouble sold his land. So huge amounts of native land was lost. And then this woman named Eloise Cabell filed lawsuit in the 1980s and said, "Hey, this was unfair. We need that land back." And they were able. The lawsuit, the court decision lasted until last year. The ramifications of it, and they were able to get 3 million acres back. That allows them to have environmental strictures that they want on their own land.
Did you happen to see Yellowstone? Did you watch?
Unfortunately, I did. Everybody, I know I have to catch up with it, but I caught up with Breaking Bad very late. After everybody had stopped talking about it, I'm going to catch up with Yellowstone, but no, I haven't seen it yet.
Well, I'll be curious to ask you when you do about how you feel the native issues are handled and so forth. But I was also reading, I think it was in your magazine, about concern about the national parks here in the West and maybe throughout the country because of all that's being done on social media. I mean, people are doing weird things and they're posting them on social media. And I mean, so some of it's a real threat to the environment, and it's also a threat to, the animals that are there and so forth.
And their own safety.
Well, and their safety, absolutely, but they're lobbing like golf balls into. I mean, this is funny in a way, but it's also serious stuff because it's doing some real harm, having some real effect on the parks themselves. Any thoughts about that as you reflect?
Well, yes. First, let me give you a very quick background of that story. I had conceived of that story, which not done by me, but done by Randy Kaur, who was a student working for me that quarter. I guess it was spring quarter last year. I'm forgetting. I think it was spring quarter last year. In any case, I was talking with a colleague at the Lane Center and said, I really like to do something about social media and national parks because I really think it's a bad mixture and this is that. And then she looked at me and then I looked at her, and in the silence, I realized what her look meant. And I said, I guess you're right. I don't use social media very much. I'm not the one who should do that story. And she said, yes, a student should do that story. So Randy did a fantastic job. And as you pointed out, she looked at the horrible things. She looked at some good things too. There are some really obnoxious influencers. I didn't even know influencer was a job until recently, but there are some really obnoxious influencers who go out and, so it's about them, not about the park, and they're using it as backdrop and they're hitting golf balls into it or doing other even worse things. But there are other social media people who are working very hard to try to show people what's right about the parks and how you should handle them. And another group that's working to try to get African Americans into the parks because they've never felt welcome there. And this group is saying, hey, if you follow us on Instagram or TikTok or wherever they were, this is what you should be doing. So I don't think social media, your reaction is a little bit like my original one. And I think that has something to do with our age. But I don't think social media is necessarily a great thing for the parks. But I don't think it's as awful as we think it is.
Well, we should also footnote this by saying not all influencers bring in an income, and they're all trying to outdo each other, many of them. So we have to bring that into the picture as well. I'd like to also bring into the picture, because you have written about this, coal in the West, and it's been used even the word demonized as an industry because of all the bad effects it's had on the environment. But there, as you also point out, I think wisely and prudently, there are a lot of people who can't make a living because of what's been done to demonize coal. And we've got this terrible tension here, really, in some ways maybe irreconcilable. Your thoughts?
And let me take you back to what you were just saying about indigenous people. There are plenty of indigenous folks in Montana who have coal. Coal is their economy.
Yeah.
They mine coal on their reservation, and they care about the environment, but they also care about their economy. I think, Michael, it is absolutely horrible to say this, and it's true, and it kind of needs to be said. There are people who are going to have to be retrained, economies that are going to have to be restructured so that coal is not a part of it. And that's going to hit hardest in the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. But certainly you've seen there are ports that were going to be built to export coal or natural gas. that have been blocked. All this coal has been important in the development of the West. Coal can't be important in the West's future if we're going to live as a planet. So, as I say, it's a horrible thing to sort of sit airily out in California and say, okay, you guys can't have a living anymore. But you have to work to find something else for folks to do so that the economy of coal doesn't continue.
Well, what you're saying makes perfect sense. I don't know how it would go over in West Virginia with Joe Manchin, for example, but in the West, it has a whole different flavor to it.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
has a whole different context to it, really. You were talking about, well, we've been talking about a lot of things I'd like to explore more, but you said something about the rubber meeting the road before, and it also reminded me of reading something about animal migrations and the fact that there's a real difficulty with our roads in the West and migrating animals. This affects native populations too.
Absolutely. Wildlife tunnels are now much more commonplace than they were 10 or 15 years ago. But they started in part because the Salish Kootenai Reservation in western Montana, a major state road goes through them. I forget what the route number is. And the state said, hey, we want to widen this road. It goes through your reservation. Can we do it? And the answer was only if you take care of the wildlife. And that was the first major build out of wildlife tunnels in western Montana along this road. And then other people, other environmental groups and animal supporters of animal rights said, hey, wildlife migrates in corridors. Your roads are getting in the way. I think Route 80 was probably the worst thing to upset the migration of pronghorn antelope. But we're going to have to create a way for the wildlife to get through. And it's happened bit by bit, but it's really accelerated. I think there's a group in Los Angeles that's going to spend $80 million or more to build a tunnel under 10 lanes of Route 10. And that is, I forget whether it's Route 10 or Route 5, but I think it's Route 10. But in any case, that shows how important this has become. Part of the reason is insurance companies, again, they're getting a lot of claims from people who are hurt or killed or their car is destroyed because they hit a deer. So that's an incentive to protect human life and insurance company profits. But I think the much greater incentive is the West as a culture values wildlife, maybe because they hunt it, maybe because they watch it, maybe because they follow it, maybe they're bird watchers, and maybe they just are hikers and love to see the wildlife on trail. It isn't that people back east don't love wildlife. I think they are more central to people's lives in the West, and the proof of that is the explosion of these wildlife tunnels.
Do you think of the West as a culture? I don't mean monolithic culture, but certainly it's different than the East or the South or the Midwest, has its own cultural values and so forth. And yet it's divided. Certainly when you think about Western states, I mean, politically and culturally, never the twain, if you put a couple of states together, will meet.
Yeah, I think this is not a direct answer. Yes, the West does have its own culture. Identify that culture. What makes up that culture? Anytime I say something, I'm an Easterner, born and bred, and so I'd have to say, well, we do that back east too. Yes, we love trails. Yes, we love animals. Yes, we have lots of new innovations in other places in the West. But the West has a peculiar chemistry where innovation and I don't totally believe in, as you know, and David Kennedy doesn't either, the rugged individual. Well, most of the West was built with federal dollars, so the rugged individual does need a little help along the way. But there is that culture of we can do it and we can be part of it and we can be close to it that I think permeates the rural West. And it is, politically, it may have turned people in directions that one wouldn't expect or necessarily be fond of, but it is its own thing, Western culture. It is different than Eastern culture, even if some of the things I'd say that are the standout things about Western culture. Let me see if I can say that better. That are the things that are the essence of Western culture seem the same in other parts of the country, but they have a peculiar edge in the West.
And speaking of the West, the name came up in a recent reading of some of your work. Somebody I interviewed a number of years ago a few times and thought of as a visionary, and I wondered if you could maybe update us. I'm talking about Amory Lovin's Rocky Mountain Institute. I used to talk to him about environmental issues, but also, so many things that he was, like you, so well versed in and so really explicit about. What's happened to the Rocky Mountain Institute? I'm just curious,
I actually did a Q&A with Amory a little over a year ago. He's flourishing. The Rocky Mountain Institute is flourishing. He's still growing bananas in his house in Colorado. And if you do a Zoom with him, he'll take his computer right up next to the bananas so you can see them. He still is, as the bananas show, a huge advocate for solar energy. He is not an advocate for nuclear energy. That came clear.
I remember that, yeah.
But he is flourishing, and the Institute is flourishing. And I actually ran into one of his associates when I went to a meeting in Boise a couple of years ago of the Society of Environmental Journalists. So he's keeping his fingers in a lot of different places of interest in the West.
Well, thank you for that update. I'm glad to hear he's still flourishing. And you have been flourishing as this environmental journalist for years now, but you did a kind of pivot. You were in Moscow. You interviewed Sakharov. You, as I said earlier, had a front seat at Chernobyl. What turned you to the environment, and how did that happen?
I wish I could say that was a movement of my heart. It should have been, now that I know what I know. But my husband worked for the New York Times. I worked for the New York Times. In Moscow, he's the bureau chief. I'm working for him. It's a direct conflict of interest, and there's nothing to do about it. It's a small bureau. When we get back to the States, he's the Washington bureau chief, and I had been covering the United Nations, which I loved, but it was right at the beginning of the Iraq War, and Phil was moved down to Washington. My choice was, could we have a commuting marriage and I'd stay in New York and cover the UN and he'd be in Washington? No. We decided that was a bad idea. What was I going to do in Washington? What jobs existed in the Bureau that didn't report to the bureau chief? And there was one, the National Environmental Reporter. And so it was arranged that I would take that job. I vividly remember what the executive editor, Joe Lelyveld, said, because I loved the UN job and I didn't want to give up the UN job. And I remember Joe said, when you're standing looking out over the Grand Canyon, the UN cafeteria isn't going to look so attractive.
Well, you flourished, and it was certainly a good move in every sense of the words, good. In fact, I knew Joe Lelyveld, and we did a podcast on a guy named Perry Garfinkel who wrote a book about Gandhi, and Joe I interviewed about his book about Gandhi. And his father was a very important figure because I grew up in Cleveland.
Oh, if you grew up in Cleveland, yes, you know his father.
I knew his father, who went down, and got beat up protesting, essentially, along with Schwerner and Goodman and people like that during Mississippi terrible times, trying to get blacks registered, essentially, as voters. Let's talk about Russia a little bit, though, because it fascinates me. And we're both Russian speakers, and I'm interested in, you say you're conversant. Like I say, you don't use it, you lose it. And I don't use it enough. Maybe we could, when we're not doing a podcast sometimes, rectify that. But tell me a little bit about those years. They were extraordinary years because you were there during Glasnost and Perestroika, right?
Yeah, it was probably the most exciting and rewarding journalistic experience of my life. We came in the fall of '85. Gorbachev had been in office maybe 6 months. I don't remember exactly. But it was still the cold, hard, oppressive Soviet Union. It didn't matter that Gorbachev was the face.
Which it is again, of course.
And well, Russia now, but otherwise, yes. But what happened was, Serge Feynman was bureau chief when we came, and he had deep experience in Russia. He left after about a year. Phil took the bureau chief's job, and Bill Keller came in. So we were all three, as it were, newbies, writing about a country that had been studied in depth by other journalists and by plenty of academics, including Phil's brother William Taubman, who's written a book on Gorbachev. But we were watching something change, and we didn't have the standing to make people believe us. So I vividly remember when Joe Lelyveld and Max Frankel, who was then the executive editor, came to Moscow, and we were sitting in our living room, and this was 1986, and saying, "Is this real?" And we said, "Yeah, we think it's real." What is the evidence? The evidence is that things that could never be published before are being published. Movies that never could have been made before are being made and shown. Theatrical things that could never have been produced before. Gorbachev changed the culture. And of course, as history will demonstrate, he changed the culture in a way that was explosive and made people really want to talk about things, to defy authority, to do all sorts of things that have been forbidden before. He didn't change the economy as fast as he changed the culture. And that in the end was his greatest problem. The economy eventually changed. One of the lines I used, Michael, I think you'd appreciate this, having studied the Soviet Union, was people would say in 1988 when we were leaving, what is the new society going to do? What's it going to be like when it has capitalism? And my line was, well, they've always been taught that capitalism is theft, and that's what they'll do.
That's a good line. And certainly come back in many ways to resonate. How do you feel now when you look at Russia, present day, Putin?
Terrible. Sad. It is. If you look at the bookshelf behind me, I'm sorry that your listeners can't do that, but you'll see a lot of books about Russian artists or Russian language or Russian literature books. I really fell in love with that culture. I loved seeing it explode in the time I was there. I loved seeing people grasp at new opportunities of how to think and how to be. And I can't imagine that that'll happen again for a good long time, because whoever replaces Putin, and somebody will eventually, will maybe even to his right, and even more of an autocrat. And so it's immense sorrow, I feel, for we got a glimpse of what could be and could have continued to be, and now it's been taken away.
Yeah, you make me mindful of something my grandfather, who escaped from Russia, used to say, and that was, this era is bad enough, we don't necessarily need a new one. It could be worse. I mean, it's proven to be sort of part of Russia's history and, unfortunately, the reality. So you ever think about going back to Russia?
We went back in with our sons when they were teenagers in the mid-'90s, and it was fascinating. First, the kids had been tiny, under the age of 5 when we came, and we went to our old apartment building. Our older son said, "No, this isn't where I lived. This is not where I lived," because he had suddenly grown to 6'3" and he was no longer 4 feet tall, and he couldn't believe everything was so small. But that was still in the Yeltsin period. There was still things were opening up. The gangs were certainly opening up. We went to department stores and saw people wandering around with AK-47s. That was something different. But right now, Michael, I couldn't go back except to see a few friends that I'd want to see, but me seeing them would get them in trouble. So I couldn't do that. There are friends who I want to get in touch with and say, "How are you doing now?" I don't feel I can do that because I'll get them in trouble. These were things I worried about in the first years as a reporter there, and I worry about them again. I think there are other places in the world I want to see, and I'll have to leave Russia and go.
Well, you have a singular identity now with the West, and I guess when you think about the traditional Soviet Union's attitude toward the West, I mean, not our American West, but the West in general, It's been antipathetic, unfortunately, and some filled with enmity. Those were good years during Gorbachev. I mean, very promising and hopeful. So I think you were very fortunate to have had those experiences and cherished them. What's next for you and your magazine?
Well, we keep on going. I should have said early on, what we try to do, since we've got a tiny staff, I'm half-time and I have one student working with me every quarter. That's not a lot of people. I can't do big breaking stories. I can look over the horizon, or I can go behind stories and look at what hasn't been told. And I want to continue to do that. So there is a story I'd like to do before too long about what happens to reservations when many of the residents leave and go to the city. And there are things like, to be a accredited reservation, you have to have a certain amount of population. What happens if the population goes away? What happens to the native culture within the people who have gone? Can they keep it? I mean, you and I have trouble keeping Russian. I think keeping your culture is probably easier than that. But what happens to them? There are a couple of other things I'd like to do that I want to look. There's a story actually we have done that I'm incredibly proud of, and you'll see it when it comes out. I asked Xavier Martinez, who was my intern this past spring, to do a story about the horse in the West and its role in the culture and its role in the economy going forward and how that's changed. And he did it absolutely brilliantly. It's just a great look from the culture being the Westerns we watched as kids, Gunsmoke or Bonanza or whatever else, and how those don't relate at all. Yellowstone goes back to the old, he points that out in his story, Yellowstone, the TV series, goes back to the old version of the horse in the West, but they've become something totally different. There's the wild horse issue. Horses are an economic force on dude ranches. You couldn't have dude ranches without horses.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. I look forward to reading that.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to tell you too many more because we haven't got time.
You've done what you need to do. You've tantalized. You've piqued our curiosity and made us want to read that. And I keep thinking about the West more and more because of this series that we've been fortunate enough to do with the Lane Center. And I'm grateful to have had you here with us. Let me also extend my thanks to all who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can find on Apple and Spotify and our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, again, I invite you to join simply by going to our website, graymatter.show. You can find previous episodes there, and that's, again, Gray with an E. Also, invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. I want to thank our great team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya. We thank the Bill Lane Center and its current director, Professor Bruce Kane, for sponsoring this series, and we invite you to visit the center's website at west.stanford.edu to learn more about its research, programs, and journalism. You can follow the Bill Lane Center on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And thanks for all of you who will be listening to this episode, and special thanks again to Felicity Barringer.
Michael, thank you.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.